let's take a look at how to group elements together and resequence them to make them sew out in a way that's more appropriate for your application. The design that I have up in DesignShop right now is a nice left chest size design. And if I click on slow redraw, we can watch it sew out. And right now it's sewing out from left to right, and it's sewing out from the top to the bottom. And that's going to feel very normal for a lot of us because that's how we read. However, if I'm going to sew this on a cap, generally I want to push away from anchor points on a cap. So I'm going to change this design to sew on a cap. And what I mean by anchor points, for that cap we've got a center seam that's not going to move, and we've got a bill that's not going to move. So I don't want to sew towards it, I want to sew away from it. So for a cap, I typically want to sew from the bottom up, and I want to sew from the center out. That way I'm sewing away from the bill, and I'm sewing away from that center seam. So let's see if we can resequence this design to make it sew out a little bit better for a cap. When I look over in the project view, I've got a green, and then a black, and then a green again. So one really quick and easy way to resequence this, I've got high school sewing last. I want it to sew first, so I can sew from the bottom up. I can sew away from that bill. So I can drag this up in the project view to sew first. One thing that I want to be careful about, right now I have this green, and they are the exact same color of thread. And if I were to resequence them right now, they would automatically merge together because I have auto merge color blocks turned on. This is turned on by default in your software. However, it is sticky, so if I uncheck it or if I click it so that it's no longer on, it will stay that way until the next time I'm using DesignShop and I want to turn it back on again. So it will stay until you change it. When I have this turned off, now I can drag this up, but my color blocks still stay individual. So I have green and then another green. That's a really quick way for me to select Lawrence and then drag it down. So this is the way that I would prefer to do it. So now, if I hit slow redraw, we're seeing that it's sewing out from the bottom towards the top. Now just for an example of what not to do, I'm going to turn on auto merge color blocks so you can see why I was trying to avoid this. If I were to drag this up, now it would merge into the one above it, and now I would have to go back in to this big single color block and find all the pieces that I wanted to resequence, and I really don't want to do that. So I would hit undo or Control Z, and I would make sure that this is not turned on if I'm going to be resequencing color blocks that I know I'm going to want to select again later. Alright, so I'm sewing high school, and then the line, and then Lawrence. So I'm definitely sewing from the bottom towards the top. I'm sewing away from that bill. Now let's take a look at how to sew away from the seam. If I turn on the design origin, I can see the middle of my design. I can see 0, 0, X, and Y. This is a great indicator for where that seam of that hat is probably going to fall. So if I look at this vertical line, that's probably where that seam is going to be. So now I want to find a place to divide it. With high school, I have a nice little gap between my words close to the seam. And if I have a gap close to the seam where there's a gap between the letters that would be a word spacing, I'm probably going to choose to divide it there. That way, if it doesn't line up exactly, when I come back and start sewing again, it's not going to be nearly as noticeable as if there was a slight shift in placement between letters within the same word. It's just kind of a way to hide that maybe there's an imperfection there, but you're never going to notice because there's a word space there. So that's where I'm going to choose to divide this up. So I'm going to look for high. I'm going to expand this out, and I can see kind of the individual parts that make up these letters. If this was keyboard lettering, I could go in and I could choose that nifty little center out or bottom up stitch order icon, but because this isn't keyboard lettering, because this is something that somebody digitized, I have all of these parts that make it up. So now I need to go in, find those elements, and resequence them. Since high is sewing first, I'm going to keep it sewing first. I'm just going to change the stitch order so that it's sewing this H, and then the G, and then the I, and then the H, and then I can leave school to sew out as it's already done. It's just a way for me to minimize my own work. So, a couple of things to pay attention to. If I select any element of this H, I'm only going to get that one element because there are lots of pieces that make it up. If I want to select everything in the H, I can click and drag a box around it to get everything in the H. And what's kind of nice about this is it actually selected that trim too. So when I'm resequencing, it's already going to have that trim in there. Nice and handy. If I want to be able to click on this H and get everything that's in it, I could group the H. What that does when I group an element is it will combine all of those elements into one group. So if I click anywhere on that group, I'm going to get everything in there with one single click. That's really handy. The group icon is located just above the project view. So once I have everything selected, I'm going to move over, hover over the icon, make sure I have the right one. This is group. So I'm going to click on group, and I get a little number 1 beside all the elements in that group. That number 1 just means that's the first group I've made today. So I can deselect. Now whenever I click any element within this H, I'm going to get the whole thing. That's really nice. You can do this. You don't have to do it. If I wanted to ungroup it, I could select that group, hover over the ungroup icon, that's the one on the right, click on it, and it would ungroup that. So let's do this one more time. I'm going to click and drag a box around everything that I want to select. I'll come up here and group that element. So now if I'm working on something else and I come over and I click on this one element, I'm going to get everything in it. Group is a really handy tool for elements with outlines that you want to select everything and move everything all at once and you don't want to leave anything behind. It's a great way to keep everything together. So I've got this H. I want to resequence it so that it is sewing first. I'm going to drag it up in this list. Pay attention to that line. Wherever that line is, that's where it's going to insert. I'm going to drag it all the way up to the top. I let go, and now this H is sewing first. So I've got the H. Then I'm going to click and drag a box around the G. I'm going to select the G in the project view, and I'm going to drag it up. And I'm going to insert it right after that H. Let go. So now it's sewing H, and then the G, and I need to go get that I. If you recognize those elements in the project view, you can grab them here too. So that's just one little vertical element, and I'm going to grab this trim as well. I held Shift to grab that element. Now I can click and drag this up so that it's sewing after the G. So I've got H, and then G, and then I, and then H, and then it's sewing out school the same way that it was. So let's go slow redraw. Let's watch this sew out. So the bottom is definitely sewing from the center out. That's great. This line, there's not a real good way to make this line sew from the center out because it's just one horizontal line. However, a way to minimize any distortion is to give yourself a good underlander there. And for this, we've got that edge walk going along that whole piece. So we know that we've got that tacked down before we start sewing over it and sew towards that seam. Let's look at how to resequence Lawrence now. Let me collapse this color block and let me expand out the next one. So right now Lawrence is sewing from left to right. I don't really need to worry about this second half of the word because it's already sewing the correct direction. It's sewing E, N, C, and E. I just have to worry about the first half. So again, I can click and drag a box around what I want. There we go. I've got all of those pieces and I can resequence that up in the list so that it's sewing the first thing in the color. If you are having trouble selecting those elements, so let me grab that W. That W is really nice and easy to see because it's one single element. Let me grab that trim. Holding, this time I held Control, click and drag up in the list. So Control selects non-consecutive elements, Shift selects consecutive elements. Since I only had 2, it really didn't matter which one I used. Now, if I'm having trouble clicking and dragging and getting what I want, you may find using the custom point selection tool a little bit easier to draw around what you want. And if you're having a lot of trouble, zoom in. That will help out a lot. So I hit enter to close that shape. I've got all of that. If I wanted to group it, I could. Sometimes that makes my life a little bit easier. And now I will drag this element up in the list so that it sews before that L. Now when I did that, I kind of left that trim behind. Let me drag that trim up as well so that I have a trim between those letters. And now it is sewing high school from the center out, it's sewing that middle line, and then it's sewing Lawrence from center out. So now I have a design. Let me play this one more time. I have a design that is sewing from the center out. It's sewing from the bottom up. And it's pushing any ripple of material towards the outside of the design where it's not going to do nearly any kind of damage. It's going to push any distortion away from your design and away from that center seam and that bill. So you can take designs that were digitized and you can resequence them. Now this one's a fairly easy design to resequence. There's not a lot of layers. There are simple elements and you can select those and drag them up or down in that project list to resequence them and make it so much better for a cap.